Welcome to Stories TH. Today's story is a powerful journey of resilience, survival, and the strength to overcome. Emily Turner, a young woman who faced unimaginable hardship and abuse, chose to break free from her past and start anew. Her journey is one of healing, self-discovery, and the incredible power of forgiveness. Watch as Emily's story unfolds and see how she found the strength to rise above it all. If you've ever felt trapped, this video is for you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories like this. Introduction to the character and setting. Main character. Emily Turner is a young woman in her early 20s, born into a family struggling with poverty. She is the only daughter of her parents, and from a very young age, she has had to endure the harsh realities of life. Emily's childhood has been overshadowed by the absence of a father figure. Her biological father passed away when she was just a toddler, leaving her mother, Lucy, to raise her alone. The loss of her father left a void in Emily's life that no one could fill. And as she grew older, she began to sense that she was growing up in a world that offered few opportunities for people like her. Her mother, Lucy, is a hard-working woman who has always done her best to provide for Emily. But due to her own experiences of hardship, she has often been emotionally unavailable. Her dedication to Emily is unwavering, but the constant struggle to make ends meet has led to a strained relationship, as Emily feels that her mother is too worn down by life's challenges to offer the love and support she craves. This feeling of abandonment intensifies when Lucy marries Charles, Emily's stepfather, a man whose presence in their lives brings nothing but violence and fear. Charles is an alcoholic who has no patience or love for Emily. His cruel and belittling attitude towards her escalates as she gets older, and soon, his volatile temper becomes a regular part of Emily's daily life. The constant fear and abuse she faces at the hands of Charles weigh heavily on Emily, leaving her feeling trapped and powerless. Despite these circumstances, Emily does her best to stay strong, often retreating into her books and her imagination to escape the bleakness of her reality. However, deep down, she longs for a life where she can feel safe, loved, and free from the tyranny of her stepfather's violence. Emily is intelligent, resourceful, and resilient, though her circumstances have held her back from fully realizing her potential. She excels in school, and despite the chaos at home, she works hard to maintain her grades and to hold on to the small pieces of normalcy in her life. But Emily's internal struggle is growing, and she is beginning to question her worth and her ability to break free from her circumstances. She feels that she deserves more, but the path to a better life seems elusive, blocked by the oppressive forces of both her home life and the social environment around her. Setting. The story takes place in a small, quiet town in the eastern United States, one where traditional values and social norms are still very much in play. The town is nestled in a rural area, surrounded by rolling hills and forests, but it is also a place where class distinctions and social expectations run deep. People are judged based on their social standing, and the divide between the wealthy and the poor is stark. For those like Emily and her mother, who live on the fringes of society, life can be especially difficult. The small-town mindset is both a source of comfort and oppression, with a rigid set of rules that are difficult to escape. Emily's family lives in a dilapidated, old house that sits on the outskirts of the town, far away from the more affluent areas. The house is in a state of disrepair, with broken windows, peeling paint, and a crumbling foundation. Inside, the atmosphere is no better. Furniture is sparse and old. The walls are lined with faded wallpaper, and the floors creak with every step. The small space they call home is filled with tension, as Emily's mother does her best to maintain a semblance of normalcy, while Charles's abusive behavior continues to destroy any sense of peace they might have had. The house, much like their lives, is in a constant state of decline. Emily often finds herself retreating to her room, where she can escape the madness of her home life, even if just for a few moments. The town itself reflects the complexities of the world Emily lives in. People are kind enough on the surface, but there is an underlying judgment of those who don't meet the town's expectations. Emily's family is seen as one of the lesser families in the town, a family of workers and the poor, who are looked down upon by the more affluent residents. Emily has always been aware of this divide, and as she grows older, she becomes more acutely aware of how people treat her differently because of her social class. This makes her feel even more isolated and invisible in a place that seems to place so much value on material wealth and status. In a town where appearances are everything, Emily struggles to find her own identity and self-worth, especially when faced with the constant comparison to others who have so much more. The town also serves as a reminder of the limitations placed on Emily by both her family and society. There are few opportunities for someone like her to break free from the confines of poverty, and the social structures of the town make it difficult to imagine a life beyond the one she's known. But as Emily grows older and begins to challenge the beliefs that have held her back, she starts to question the power that these societal structures have over her future. With every struggle she faces, Emily's resilience and determination grow stronger, even as the harshness of her environment continues to wear her down. The backdrop of Emily's small-town life, with its close-knit but judgmental community and the crumbling house that symbolizes her family's struggles, serves as a perfect setting for a story about overcoming adversity. Despite the oppressive forces around her, Emily's desire for a better life and her longing for freedom push her to take action. She may feel trapped in her circumstances, but she is determined to find a way out. As the story unfolds, the town, her family, and the small house will all play crucial roles in Emily's journey of self-discovery, survival, and ultimately, transformation. The hardships and fears of Emily. Emily's fear. Emily Turner's life is defined by a suffocating sense of fear and hopelessness. Each day feels like a repetition of the last one, where she is caught in an unrelenting cycle of oppression and violence. Her home is a place of constant tension, where Charles, her abusive stepfather, rules with a mix of anger and intimidation. For Emily, every decision she makes is overshadowed by the fear that it won't matter, that no matter how hard she tries, nothing will change the brutal reality of her life. She wakes up every morning to the familiar sound of Charles's heavy footsteps, which seem to follow her no matter where she goes. She dreads the uncertainty of what the day will bring, whether it will be a verbal insult, a physical attack, or a simple, suffocating silence that makes her feel even more invisible. Emily's mind races with thoughts of escape, but they are always followed by the harsh reminder that there is nowhere for her to go. The idea of leaving is both a dream and a nightmare. She is trapped in a house that is supposed to be a place of safety, but it feels more like a prison. Every word, every movement is calculated. Emily has learned to keep her head down, to avoid making noise, and to make herself as small as possible so that she won't draw attention to herself. She knows that Charles's moods are unpredictable, and the slightest provocation could set him off. The fear of his wrath weighs heavily on her every day, and with each passing year, that fear becomes more ingrained in her. She doesn't feel like a person anymore. She feels like a shadow, someone who exists only to be controlled, someone who can't possibly matter in a world that seems to constantly reject her. The external pressure is compounded by Emily's internal conflict. She is acutely aware of her lack of options. She has been taught, both by Charles's violent behavior and by society's judgment, that she has no voice. She feels isolated, even in the presence of her mother, who remains emotionally distant due to her own traumatic experiences. This sense of being unheard, unseen, and helpless has become a part of Emily's identity, and it's a battle she has fought quietly in the confines of her own mind. She wants to escape. She dreams of a life where she is free to be herself, where she doesn't have to live in fear, but every time she attempts to take a step toward freedom, the weight of her reality pushes her back into submiss. Shaun. Emily's fear isn't just limited to her immediate surroundings. It's also rooted in the idea that the world outside her home is equally unwelcoming. She's seen how people treat her differently because of her social class and her background. The isolation she feels at home is mirrored in the world outside, where judgment and discrimination based on her poverty make her feel like she has no place. This feeling of being trapped, both within the four walls of her home and within society's limitations, makes Emily's world feel incredibly small and suffocating. The psychology of a victim. The psychological toll of living in an abusive household is profound. Emily has spent most of her life in an environment where love and safety were absent, replaced instead by manipulation, control, and violence. As a victim of abuse, Emily has internalized the notion that she is powerless, that she does not have the right to speak out or to stand up for herself. Her self-worth is diminished with every insult, every blow, and every cruel remark from Charles. Her mind constantly oscillates between disbelief and resignation, unable to comprehend why the people who are supposed to love and protect her, the people she most trusts, are the ones who hurt her the most. Her stepfather's cruel behavior, particularly the way he belittles her at every turn, has led Emily to believe that she is unworthy of anything better. His words sting like poison, leaving marks on her psyche that are far deeper than any physical scars he could inflict. Emily has learned to anticipate the worst, expecting Charles's anger and outbursts to come at any moment. The unpredictability of his behavior means she has to be constantly alert, constantly second-guessing herself. It becomes nearly impossible to relax, to feel safe, or to think clearly when everything around her is in a state of turmoil. Emily's inability to speak out about the abuse is one of the most debilitating aspects of her experience. She feels as though no one would believe her, or worse, that they would see her as weak or as someone who deserves the punishment she is receiving. This is compounded by the guilt she feels for not being able to protect her mother, who is also a victim of Charles's abuse. Lucy, her mother, is too emotionally drained by years of suffering to provide the support Emily desperately needs. Emily watches as her mother grows increasingly numb to the violence around them, unable to muster the strength to intervene or to take action to stop the abuse. The once strong woman Emily remembered is now broken by years of trauma, and the weight of their shared suffering becomes too much for both of them to bear. Emily's relationship with her mother is marked by a deep sense of guilt and responsibility. She wants to protect her, but feels unable to do so. She longs for her mother to be the protector, the strong figure who can shield her from harm. But instead, it is Emily who often finds herself trying to shield her mother from Charles's fury. In turn, Emily's inability to protect her mother makes her feel more isolated and helpless. There is a deep sense of emotional conflict within her. A young girl who still craves the love and safety of her mother, yet has been forced to grow up too quickly due to the circumstances of her life. Emily's sense of helplessness is not only emotional, but also physical. She is often the target of Charles's wrath when things go wrong, from his anger over a spilled drink to his frustration over her schoolwork. There are days when Emily feels like she can't escape, where the constant barrage of insults and threats feels like it will swallow her whole. The physical abuse is just another manifestation of the mental and emotional torment that she faces on a daily basis. The fear of Charles's rage is so ingrained in Emily that she no longer has the ability to trust others or to let her guard down. At the heart of it all, Emily's greatest fear is the fear of being forgotten, of being nothing more than a ghost in her own life, trapped in a place where no one sees her pain or acknowledges her suffering. This fear prevents her from reaching out for help and keeps her in a state of emotional paralysis. She feels invisible, not only in her own home, but also in the world around her, where poverty and status ensure that her voice will always be drowned out by others. Emily's story is not just about survival, but also about the silent and enduring battle of a young girl who is trying to find herself in a world that wants to keep her invisible. It's about the ongoing fight to reclaim her voice, her dignity, and the hope that one day she will be able to break free from the chains that bind her. Her journey is not just one of physical escape, but one of emotional healing, self-discovery, and the search for a life that is free from fear. The decision to change her life. The beginning of the journey. The moment that Emily Turner's life began to shift occurred after a particularly traumatic event. Charles, her violent stepfather, in one of his drunken rages, lashed out in a way that left her utterly broken. Emily had always endured his insults and occasional physical violence, but this time, something in her snapped. The event itself wasn't the worst that had happened to her. She had endured worse before, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Emily found herself staring into the cold, unforgiving eyes of Charles one evening after he had torn through the house in a fit of rage. Her mother, Lucy, had been caught in the middle of yet another argument. For the first time, Emily saw the toll that this constant cycle of violence had taken on both of them. Her mother had lost the will to fight back, and Charles was beyond reasoning. Emily had tried, as she always did, to protect her mother from the worst of the storm. But this time, after Charles left the room, Emily found herself sitting in the kitchen, the reality of her life sinking in. The weight of the years of abuse was too much, and a small voice inside her whispered, "This can't be my life anymore." She realized that if she didn't do something, if she didn't take action, she would be condemned to a lifetime of fear, sadness, and suffocating silence. For the first time, Emily understood that she couldn't keep hoping for a change that would never come. She was not just a victim of her circumstances. She was also complicit in letting them persist. And she couldn't allow herself to keep living in this emotional prison. It wasn't an easy decision. Emily knew that trying to escape the grip of Charles would come with its own set of consequences. Leaving would not only mean breaking free from the abusive environment she lived in, but it also meant potentially destroying what little connection she had left with her mother. Her mother, while emotionally distant, was still the only family she had. The idea of leaving her behind filled Emily with guilt. She knew that Lucy, weakened by years of trauma, would never be able to protect her from Charles's fury. But Emily was no longer willing to endure a life of submission. She had been afraid for so long, but now she had a new kind of fear, the fear of never escaping, of being swallowed whole by the toxic environment of her home. It was that fear that propelled her to make the difficult choice. That night, Emily made up her mind. She would leave. She would not go quietly. She would not wait for anyone to rescue her. For the first time, she made the choice to take control of her own destiny, even if it meant severing ties with the only world she had ever known. The decision didn't come without doubts and second thoughts. Emily was well aware of the risks of her actions. She knew that escaping would be hard and that there would be no easy way forward. But she also knew that staying would slowly destroy her. She could feel the anger building inside her, anger at the world for letting this happen, but also anger at herself for not having acted sooner. The reason for the decision. Emily's realization that change would not come from anyone but herself was what solidified her decision. Up until that point, Emily had lived in the hope that someone, her mother, a teacher, a friend, would step in and save her from this miserable existence. But she knew, deep down, that waiting for someone else to make her life better was futile. No one had come to her aid before, and no one would do it now. The harsh truth was that Emily had spent too much of her life being passive, waiting for someone to notice her suffering. But she was beginning to see that no one was going to ride in on a white horse to rescue her. She could no longer wait for the cavalry that was never coming. It was then that Emily understood. The power to change her life, to take back control, was hers alone. She wasn't helpless. She didn't have to continue letting her circumstances dictate her future. She could take charge, break free from the cycle of abuse, and build a life for herself that was free of fear and violence. It was terrifying to consider, but Emily realized that she had reached a crossroads. If she remained passive and stayed in that house, she would be condemning herself to a life of misery. But if she found the courage to act, even if it meant facing an uncertain and daunting future, she could change everything. The weight of this realization lifted a small part of the burden from Emily's shoulders. She understood that it wasn't just about leaving her abusive stepfather. It was about reclaiming her identity, finding her own voice, and standing up for the person she could become. For the first time in her life, Emily stopped seeing herself as a victim. She was still living in the shadow of what Charles had done to her, but she had begun to see the possibility of a different life, one where she wasn't defined by her past, but by what she chose to do in the present. Her decision was not one born out of anger, but rather out of the understanding that her survival depended on her ability to take action. She could no longer afford to live in fear, to pretend that everything would be okay if she just kept her head down and waited for the storm to pass. Emily's past had shaped her, but it did not have to define her future. Her decision to leave was an act of defiance against everything that had held her back. It was an act of self-rescue, and though she didn't know what would come next, she was ready to take the first step towards a better life, one where she would no longer be trapped in the oppressive silence of her home. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges, uncertainty, and potential heartbreak, but Emily had learned that sometimes the most difficult decisions are the ones that lead to the greatest transformations. It was time to make a change, no matter the cost. It was time to take control of her destiny and rewrite her future. And this decision, though fraught with fear and doubt, was the first step towards the life she had always dreamed of. The relationship with her mother and betrayal. The relationship between mother and daughter. Emily Turner's relationship with her mother, Lucy, was once the most consistent and reliable aspect of her life. Emily clung to the idea that her mother, though often worn down and emotionally drained, was her protector. She had been the one to shield Emily from the brunt of Charles's cruelty during the early years of their marriage. However, as time went on, Emily began to realize that the woman who had once been her rock was no longer able to provide the safety she so desperately needed. Lucy's resilience had slowly eroded under the constant strain of abuse and fear. Instead of fighting for Emily's safety, she had become numb to the violence and chaos that plagued their home. Though Emily's mother always expressed love and concern for her, there was a palpable difference in the way she interacted with Emily as the years passed. Lucy's attempts at defending her daughter became less frequent, less effective. Each time Charles lashed out, Emily could see her mother shrink further into herself. The verbal and physical abuse had taken a toll on Lucy, and her spirit seemed to fade as she silently endured the same suffering she had once stood up against. Emily's mother's inability to protect her from Charles began to gnaw at Emily's heart. The woman she had trusted to always be there for her was becoming a shadow of the person she used to be. At first, Emily tried to understand her mother's passivity. She saw how beaten down Lucy had become by years of living with an abusive partner, and how afraid she was of angering Charles further. Lucy, too, was a victim in her own right, and Emily understood that. However, as time went on, the frustration within Emily grew. How could Lucy, the woman who had once stood tall, allow this to happen again and again? Emily needed her mother to be her protector, to be the one person who would fight for her no matter what. But Lucy's reluctance to act made Emily feel increasingly abandoned. Emily often found herself wondering why her mother couldn't see the depths of the situation they were in. She was the one who was supposed to intervene, to fight back, to show Emily that there was hope. But instead, Emily felt as if she was navigating the storm alone, with no one to turn to for support. Every time Lucy cowered in the face of Charles's fury, Emily's faith in her mother diminished a little more. The worst part was that Emily couldn't even express her disappointment and hurt to her mother, because she knew that Lucy, too, was suffering, and the last thing she wanted was to add to that pain. Betrayal and disappointment. As Emily's understanding of her mother's situation deepened, so did her sense of betrayal. Emily began to feel like an outsider in her own home, where the one person she thought she could rely on had silently accepted her fate, along with the rest of the family. Lucy's continued passivity and inability to protect her daughter felt like a betrayal, even though Emily understood that her mother was a victim of abuse as well. The emotional divide between mother and daughter grew steadily, as Emily started to resent the way Lucy seemed to overlook her suffering, and more painfully, the way she refused to stand up to Charles. The relationship between Emily and her mother, once filled with unconditional love and a sense of security, began to feel strained. Emily could no longer look to her mother as her sole protector. She could no longer see Lucy as the one person who would fight for her. The line between mother and daughter became blurred as Emily wrestled with the reality that the person she depended on for support and comfort had become just as trapped in their home as she was. This silent abandonment though unspoken, hung heavily over their relationship. Emily's disappointment with her mother was compounded by the betrayal of trust she felt. The abuse had gone on for so long that Emily could no longer stand by and wait for things to change. She no longer wanted to be the victim, the one who waited for someone else to act on her behalf. But with no one to protect her, Emily had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. This was a painful realization for Emily. She never wanted to be the one to have to stand up for herself. She had always hoped for the strength of her mother to carry her through. But instead, Emily had to find the courage to face Charles, to fight for herself, even though her heart ached with the knowledge that her mother couldn't or wouldn't do the same. The feeling of betrayal was even more profound in those quiet moments when Emily's mind wandered back to the past. She remembered the times when her mother had promised to protect her, to keep her safe from harm. The memories of that promise made the present situation feel like a cruel joke. Emily had held on to the belief that as long as her mother was there, everything would be okay, that somehow they could escape the darkness together. But now, she saw her mother as someone who was just as defeated by the system as she was. Lucy's willingness to endure the abuse, to accept the life they were living, left Emily feeling as though she had been forsaken. She needed her mother to be the one to break free, to set an example of strength and courage. But Lucy's silence in the face of all that was happening had crushed that hope. As Emily's sense of betrayal grew, she also became painfully aware of how deeply her mother had been changed by the years of violence. It wasn't just that Emily's mother wasn't standing up for her. It was that she had internalized the idea that she didn't deserve better, that she had to tolerate Charles's behavior. Emily began to see how much the abuse had taken away from her mother, how it had slowly chipped away at her spirit, leaving her a shell of the woman she once was. The image of her mother as a strong, fearless protector was gone, replaced by a woman who was broken and afraid. It was a reality that Emily wasn't prepared for, but it was one that she could no longer ignore. Despite the anger and disappointment, Emily knew that her mother was not entirely to blame. Emily understood that Lucy, too, was a victim of the same system that oppressed her. But the weight of the betrayal still hurt. It was hard for Emily to come to terms with the fact that her mother had been unable to protect her, and that in the end, it was up to Emily herself to change their lives. It was a burden Emily had never wanted to carry alone, but one she realized she couldn't avoid any longer. The complex emotions of betrayal, abandonment, and the need to protect herself set the stage for Emily's decision to take charge of her life. As painful as it was, Emily had reached the point where she could no longer depend on her mother or anyone else for rescue. The love she had for her mother was still there, but it was now mixed with a sense of deep disappointment. Yet, despite the hurt, Emily knew she had to step forward and be the strength her mother could no longer provide. And with that realization came the painful but necessary understanding that, in order to survive, she had to learn to protect herself first. A new life and the challenges ahead. Life after leaving home. After Emily Turner made the brave decision to leave her abusive home, she entered a world full of uncertainty and hardships, but also a sense of freedom that she had never experienced before. With the support of various charities that helped victims of domestic abuse, Emily managed to find temporary shelter and basic provisions. The first few days were a whirlwind of emotions. She was both relieved to escape the grip of her stepfather's tyranny and terrified of what the future would hold. Finding a stable job was her first priority, but Emily quickly discovered that it wasn't going to be easy. The small town she had grown up in was not exactly full of job opportunities, and as a young woman with no experience in the workforce, she found herself competing for the few low-paying positions that were available. But for the first time in her life, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She knew that this was the first step in building a life for herself, a life that wasn't controlled by fear or abuse. Emily's independence came with a price, though. Living on her own meant facing the world without the familiar comfort of a mother or a stable family environment. For years, she had been surrounded by the constant hum of violence and tension. Now, in a quiet apartment that she could call her own, the silence was deafening. She felt a mixture of relief and loneliness. Yet, even in the most difficult moments, Emily reminded herself that this was the life she had chosen, and that every day she survived was another victory. As she started working, Emily began to understand what true independence meant. She no longer had to answer to Charles or endure his drunken tirades. But there was a cost. She had to manage her own finances, make decisions about her future, and, most challenging of all, navigate the emotional and psychological scars left by her past. Each day was a new hurdle, and though she stumbled at times, Emily was determined to stand tall and face the future head-on. The new life Emily had built wasn't perfect, far from it. But it was hers, and for the first time in a long while, she felt in control. The small victories, like paying rent on time or being able to buy a meal without fear of judgment, were monumental. Slowly but surely, Emily began to rebuild herself, step by step. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but it was the only road that promised freedom. Facing challenges, the reality of Emily's new life soon set in. While she had escaped the abuse, she found that the world beyond the abusive home was not without its own set of challenges. One of the first hurdles was finding a permanent place to live. The temporary shelter she had been given was kind, but it was not a home. Emily searched for affordable housing in the city, but the process was far from easy. The rent was high, and the apartment listings were limited. Every night, she wondered whether she would have a roof over her head the next day. Living on her own also meant dealing with the loneliness that came with being cut off from her family. Her mother, though still in the same town, seemed unable to offer her any emotional support. Emily knew that her mother was struggling with her own pain, but the loneliness weighed heavily on her heart. She missed the warmth of a family dinner or the comfort of simply having someone to talk to at the end of the day. The isolation was crippling, and there were times when Emily doubted her decision. Would it have been easier to stay in the house with Charles, to simply accept the life she knew, even if it was painful? The thought lingered in her mind, but Emily would quickly remind herself that she had chosen freedom. No matter how hard things got, this was her path, and she had to keep walking it. Her work situation was equally challenging. Emily had managed to find a job as a cashier in a small grocery store, but the hours were long, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent and utilities. She found herself constantly worried about her finances, cutting back on every little luxury just to make ends meet. There were days when she barely had enough money to buy food, and the stress of living paycheck to paycheck was overwhelming. But Emily refused to give up. She knew that every step she took toward stability, no matter how small, was progress. And then there was the matter of the emotional and psychological scars from her past. The abuse had left deep marks on Emily's psyche, and though she had escaped the physical violence, the emotional trauma lingered. She found it difficult to trust people and was often hypervigilant, always expecting the worst. The memories of Charles's drunken rages and her mother's helplessness haunted her during quiet moments. She sometimes found herself frozen in place, as if the threat of violence was still hanging over her. But through therapy and the support of a local women's group, Emily began to slowly confront her past. Each session was a small step toward healing, but the process was slow and painful. Despite all the setbacks and obstacles, Emily never lost sight of the one thing that had kept her going: the desire to be free. She knew that the path she had chosen wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that it was the only one that could lead her to the life she deserved. Every challenge she faced, whether it was financial, emotional, or social, only strengthened her resolve. She learned that freedom wasn't just about escaping the abuse, it was about reclaiming her own power and fighting for a future that was hers to create. Though Emily's new life was far from perfect, she understood that it was hers to shape. She was no longer a passive participant in her own story. She had chosen to take control, to make decisions for herself, and to rise above the circumstances that had once defined her. The challenges were real, but Emily faced them with a newfound strength and determination. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning to thrive. Through it all, Emily discovered something profound about herself. Her strength was not just in surviving the abuse, but in choosing to create a new life for herself, no matter the odds. Each challenge she overcame was a testament to her resilience. and Emily began to understand that she was capable of much more than she had ever believed. She had survived the darkest of times, and now she was building the light that would guide her into a better future. 6. Finding herself and strength in encounters. 1,000 words. The encounter with others. As Emily Turner's new life unfolded, she soon realized that healing wasn't a solitary journey. Early on, she encountered others who had gone through similar struggles, people who had suffered, endured, and found their own paths to survival. They weren't just acquaintances, they became her support system, her family in ways her biological family could never have been. It started with a women's support group at a local community center. Emily had always kept to herself, believing that no one could possibly understand her pain. But one evening, encouraged by her therapist, she decided to attend one of the group meetings. What she found there was nothing short of a revelation. The room was filled with women from all walks of life, young and old, from different races and backgrounds, but each one had a story that resonated deeply with Emily. There was Sarah, a woman in her late 30s who had escaped an abusive marriage and was now working 2 jobs to support herself and her children. Sarah's eyes spoke volumes of the pain she had endured, but also of the strength she had found in herself. Emily found solace in Sarah's words, realizing that her own pain wasn't unique, it was part of a larger story, one that countless others had lived through and emerged from stronger. Then there was Janet, an older woman who had lived in a shelter for several months after leaving an abusive relationship with her partner of 20 years. Janet's journey had been long and difficult, but she spoke with such wisdom and grace, reminding Emily that it was okay to take things one day at a time, and that healing didn't happen overnight. Janet's kindness and understanding became a beacon for Emily, showing her that even after years of suffering, there was still hope for a better future. As Emily listened to their stories, she felt the weight of her own experience lighten. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like an outsider. The women in that room had faced unimaginable hardships, yet they were here, sharing their stories and supporting one another. They reminded her that she wasn't alone, and that there were people who had walked the path before her, people who had survived and come out stronger on the other side. The group became a refuge for Emily. Every week, she looked forward to the meetings, where she could speak freely without fear of judgment. With time, she found herself opening up to the women in the group, sharing her fears, her doubts, and her aspirations. They offered her advice, guidance, and most importantly, the assurance that it was okay to take her time in finding herself again. Through these encounters, Emily began to understand a fundamental truth. The path to healing wasn't linear, and it wasn't something she could rush. But it was a journey she didn't have to face alone. The women in the group showed her that strength could be found in vulnerability, and that asking for help wasn't a sign of weakness, but of courage. The journey to reclaim herself. As Emily's support network grew, she started to feel the slow, steady pull of healing. She realized that in order to truly move forward, she needed to find a way to love herself again, something that had felt impossible for so long. For years, she had blamed herself for the abuse, carrying the heavy weight of shame and guilt. But the more she learned from the women in her group, the more she began to understand that the abuse was never her fault, it was a reflection of the abuser's choices, not her worth. Emily's journey to reclaim herself was not easy. There were days when the pain of her past felt like it would swallow her whole, and the fear of the future made it hard to take even one step forward. But with the encouragement of her new friends, Emily started small. She began by setting little goals for herself each day, things as simple as getting out of bed, eating a meal, or going for a walk. These small victories began to build her confidence, showing her that she was capable of more than she had ever thought. One of the first things Emily learned was to allow herself to feel the pain without judgment. She had spent so many years suppressing her emotions, hiding her tears, and pretending that everything was fine. But the more she allowed herself to feel, whether it was sadness, anger, or fear, the more she began to process her trauma and let go of the anger she had been holding onto for so long. She also started to see the beauty in the small things, the little moments of joy that had once passed her by unnoticed. Emily took up painting again, a hobby she had loved as a child. Each brushstroke felt like a release, a way to express emotions she had never been able to put into words. She took time to care for herself, learning to appreciate her own company and finding peace in solitude. Emily also began to take better care of her physical health. She started exercising regularly, something she had never prioritized before. At first, it was hard, and the motivation was minimal, but as her body grew stronger, so did her sense of self-worth. She wasn't just healing emotionally. She was reclaiming her body, her life, and her sense of agency. In her journey to rediscover herself, Emily also sought therapy. She realized that she needed professional help to truly heal the wounds that ran deep within her. The therapist helped her to unpack years of trauma and gave her the tools to cope with her past. Slowly, Emily began to piece together a new identity, one that wasn't defined by the violence she had experienced, but by the resilience she had discovered in herself. Her journey wasn't without setbacks, of course. There were days when the memories of the abuse overwhelmed her, when the fear of being hurt again crept in. But through it all, Emily learned to keep moving forward, one small step at a time. She learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about finding peace with it and building a future that was hers to create. Through these encounters and her journey of self-love, Emily began to understand that she wasn't defined by the abuse she had suffered. She wasn't the victim, she was a survivor. And with each passing day, Emily became stronger, more confident, and more at peace with herself. She had found her strength, not in the absence of pain, but in the way she had learned to rise above it. And with that newfound strength, she was ready to embrace the future and all the possibilities it held. Confronting the abuser and inner challenge. Entering the confrontation, Emily Turner stood at the edge of a decision that would determine the course of her future. It had been several months since she left the suffocating, violent environment of her childhood home, and during this time, she had slowly begun to rebuild her life. However, the peace she had found was now being tested. Her mother, Lucy, had made the decision to stay with her abusive husband, Charles, despite Emily's desperate pleas for her to leave him. Emily was left with an agonizing choice. Should she return and confront the man who had hurt her so deeply, or should she continue to sever ties with her family in order to preserve her own peace and emotional health? The decision weighed heavily on Emily's heart. On one hand, she wanted nothing more than to keep running to keep her distance from the toxic influence of her past and protect the fragile peace she had worked so hard to establish. But on the other hand, the pull of family, especially her mother, was undeniable. She was the woman who had given birth to Emily, the woman who had always promised to protect her, but who had failed in this promise. Yet, Emily had to come to terms with the fact that, despite all her pain, she still loved her mother. Emily knew that returning to face her stepfather would not be easy. She had spent so many years living under his oppressive control, enduring his emotional and physical abuse. The memories of his violence haunted her every waking moment, and the thought of facing him again sent shivers down her spine. Yet, deep down, she understood that there was no true healing without closure. The unresolved trauma she carried was like an open wound that had been left untreated for far too long. Her mother's decision to stay with Charles had been one of the hardest pills to swallow for Emily. She could never fully understand how Lucy could continue to live with a man who had caused so much harm to her and their family. But in a way, Emily understood the fear and the feelings of powerlessness that kept her mother tethered to him. Emily had left, but her mother had stayed, perhaps because she feared the unknown, perhaps because she felt trapped in a life that seemed like no escape. Emily couldn't be sure. But what she did know was that this emotional conflict was now a test of her own resilience. Emily's heart ached as she thought about her mother's vulnerability. She knew that Lucy wasn't a bad person, that she wasn't weak by nature. But the abuse she had endured for so many years had dulled her sense of agency, her belief that she deserved more than the life she was living. And in many ways, Emily could relate to that. She, too, had been rendered powerless in the face of Charles's cruelty, but she had found the strength to break free. This was Emily's moment of reckoning. She realized that her healing could no longer be separated from her past, from the man who had broken her. If she truly wanted to move forward, she needed to confront the trauma head-on, face her abuser, and stand up for herself, not for the sake of vengeance, but for her own freedom. The liberation from within. As Emily reflected on the path ahead, she came to a sobering realization. The only way to truly free herself from the emotional chains of her past was to forgive not Charles, but herself. For so long, she had blamed herself for the way things had turned out. She believed that somehow, if she had been stronger or smarter, she could have prevented the violence, or that she should have fought harder for her mother's safety. These thoughts plagued her mind and kept her bound to a past she could not change. It was only through introspection and support from her newfound community that Emily began to understand the destructive nature of this self-blame. She had been a victim. There was no shame in that. The decisions her mother had made were hers to own, just as Emily's decisions were hers to make. But Emily could not change the past by continuously punishing herself for things beyond her control. The greatest act of healing would be to accept her story, to forgive herself for not being able to protect herself or her mother, and to release the burden of guilt that had weighed so heavily on her for so long. It was in these moments of clarity that Emily recognized the power of forgiveness, not in the sense of absolving her mother or stepfather of their wrongdoing, but in forgiving herself for the years of suffering. She could not change what had happened, but she could change how she carried it. By letting go of the guilt and resentment, she was freeing herself from the emotional chains that had kept her bound to her trauma. In forgiving herself, she was finally allowing herself the grace to heal. Emily also realized that part of her healing lay in accepting the complexities of her relationship with her mother. Lucy had her own journey, and she had made her own choices. As much as Emily wanted her mother to stand up to Charles, she could not force her to do so. Emily understood that her mother's decisions were shaped by her own fears and limitations, just as Emily's choices were guided by her own strength and growth. Emily could no longer carry the burden of her mother's choices, but she could still love her, even if they didn't always see eye to eye. This was the turning point for Emily. For years, she had carried the weight of the past, unable to move forward because she couldn't let go of her anger, her fear, and her sadness. But now, through the process of self-forgiveness, she felt a new sense of freedom. Emily wasn't defined by the abuse she had suffered. She was defined by the strength she had shown in breaking free from it, by the courage it took to walk away, and by the determination to heal, even when it seemed impossible. Emily made a final decision. She would go to the house, face Charles, and tell him that she was no longer his victim. She would tell him that he no longer had control over her. But in doing so, she knew that she didn't need to confront him in anger or seek revenge. Instead, she would stand tall, with her head held high, knowing that her power came from within. She didn't need his approval, his acknowledgement, or his apology. What she needed most was to reclaim her own voice and her own life. In that moment of decision, Emily found her liberation. She had taken back control of her life, not through external confrontation, but through an internal transformation. She had learned to forgive herself, to let go of the past, and to walk away from the toxicity that had once defined her world. By doing so, she was finally free to live a life that was hers to shape, free to pursue her dreams, and free to find peace in a world that had once seemed so full of fear. As Emily walked away from the house, a weight lifted off her shoulders. She was not running from her past, she was leaving it behind, forever. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Emily knew that she was ready for whatever came next. Her healing had begun, and nothing, not even the shadow of her past, could take that from her. Exploring forgiveness and the power of self-respect. Seeking forgiveness. Emily's journey of healing and empowerment was not an easy one. After confronting the deep scars left by her past, Emily realized that forgiveness was a necessary step in her pursuit of peace. It wasn't just about forgiving Charles or her mother, Lucy. It was about forgiving herself. She carried so much anger and resentment toward her mother for not protecting her from Charles, and toward herself for not being able to fix her broken family. But through a long process of self-reflection and support from the people around her, Emily began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about absolving others from their actions. It was about releasing the grip of negativity on her own heart. At first, Emily struggled to even consider forgiving Lucy. She had spent years feeling abandoned, and the pain of her mother choosing to stay with Charles, the man who had hurt both of them, felt like an unforgivable betrayal. Emily had wanted her mother to stand up for her, to fight back against the violence. She wanted Lucy to be the protector she had always hoped for. But Lucy's choices, though painful, were her own, shaped by years of fear and dependency. Emily realized that her mother wasn't an evil person. She was simply trapped in a cycle of abuse, struggling with her own fears and emotional scars. Forgiving her mother wasn't easy. Emily's heart had been hardened by years of betrayal, and every time she thought about forgiving her, the anger surged again. But Emily understood that holding on to this anger was only keeping her trapped in the past, in a situation she had no control over. As she sat in the small, quiet apartment she now called home, Emily began to realize that true freedom didn't lie in holding on to the past, it lied in letting it go. She could never change the decisions Lucy had made, but she could choose how to carry her own emotions moving forward. She couldn't live her life shackled by resentment. The process of forgiveness began with Emily's own internal shift. She didn't need to tell Lucy right away that she forgave her. Emily needed to feel it in her heart first. She had to let go of the bitter thoughts and memories that had kept her from healing. Forgiving her mother meant that Emily no longer had to carry the burden of anger or sadness with her. It meant she could finally free herself from the mental prison she had built around her pain. Over time, Emily learned to appreciate her mother in a different way. While Lucy's choices weren't perfect, Emily saw that her mother's love for her had always been there. It wasn't the kind of love Emily had wanted: strong, protective, and unyielding, but it was love in its own form. Lucy had done the best she could with the tools she had, even though those tools were often inadequate for the situation. As Emily let go of her anger, she allowed herself to see her mother as a human being, flawed, but still worthy of love. In this new light, Emily began to slowly rebuild her relationship with Lucy, with an understanding that it could never be the same as it had been before. But it didn't need to be perfect for Emily to find peace, self-respect, and the sense of freedom. One of the most powerful lessons Emily learned throughout her journey was the importance of self-respect. In the past, she had been so focused on pleasing others, so desperate for approval, that she neglected to honor herself. For years, she had allowed herself to be mistreated, and even though she had left her abusive home, part of her continued to hold on to the belief that she wasn't worthy of better treatment. But as Emily grew stronger, she began to understand that self-respect was not a luxury, it was a necessity. To heal, she had to accept that she deserved more than the pain and abuse she had experienced. Self-respect meant standing up for herself, even when it was uncomfortable. It meant trusting her instincts and making decisions that were in her best interest, rather than living for the approval of others. In the beginning, Emily struggled with self-doubt. She wondered if she could ever be strong enough to overcome the damage done by years of abuse. She was haunted by the feeling that she wasn't worthy of the life she was now building for herself. But as time passed, she began to silence these thoughts. Emily started recognizing the small victories along her journey, holding her head up high in public, learning to assert herself in relationships, and making choices that honored her own needs. These actions, though small, were powerful acts of self-respect. Through her own growth, Emily discovered that self-respect wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about having a flawless life or always making the right choices. It was about learning to trust herself, to love herself despite her flaws and mistakes. Self-respect was the foundation upon which Emily could build the life. She wanted a life where she didn't need to apologize for taking up space, a life where she could finally feel at peace in her own skin. In the months that followed, Emily experienced a profound shift in her understanding of what it meant to be free. Freedom wasn't just about physical escape from her abusive home, it was about emotional liberation from the chains of guilt, shame, and self-blame. As Emily let go of the need to control others and their actions, she began to realize that true freedom lay in the way she treated herself. Her newfound sense of self-respect gave her the confidence to pursue her goals with vigor. She began to dream bigger, to see herself as capable of achieving great things. Emily didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She had learned to approve of herself. With each new step, she felt more empowered to carve out a life that was entirely her own. Forgiveness as freedom. As Emily continued to reflect on her journey, she recognized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing past actions. It was about releasing the hold that anger and resentment had on her life. Forgiving her mother, forgiving herself, and even forgiving Charles was not an act of condoning his behavior. Rather, it was an act of taking back her own power. By forgiving, Emily was no longer a prisoner of her past. She had broken free from the chains of bitterness and resentment, and in doing so, she had set herself free. Forgiveness allowed Emily to rediscover her sense of agency. No longer weighed down by the emotional burdens of her past, she could now make decisions based on what was best for her, not on what others thought she should do or on the mistakes of her past. Forgiveness was not just an emotional release. It was a declaration of her worth. By choosing to forgive, Emily was affirming that she was worthy of love, respect, and a future free from abuse. Through her journey, Emily came to understand that forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, one that she would continue to practice throughout her life. There would always be moments where she would need to forgive herself for slipping into old patterns, or where she would need to forgive others for actions beyond her control. But as Emily embraced forgiveness, she also embraced the possibility of a future that was no longer defined by her trauma. She had given herself the ultimate gift, the gift of peace, self-respect, and the ability to move forward. With forgiveness came freedom. Emily had freed herself from the past, from the anger that had held her captive for so long. And in that freedom, she had found a new beginning, one that was full of hope, self-love, and the promise of a brighter future. Transformation and building a new life. Starting a new journey. Emily's life began to take on a new shape as she embarked on her journey toward independence. The weight of her past, once a suffocating force, began to feel lighter as she found the courage to rebuild her life. The first step in this transformation was securing stable employment. It wasn't easy after all. Emily had spent so many years isolated and trapped in an abusive environment that it was hard for her to imagine a future of freedom. But she refused to let fear hold her back. One of the things Emily discovered was that she had skills she never realized she possessed. Despite the trauma and abuse, she was resourceful and capable. After a few months of searching and applying for jobs, Emily finally landed a position at a local coffee shop. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her the financial stability she desperately needed. The work was physically demanding, and sometimes Emily was tired and overwhelmed, but there was a sense of pride in being able to support herself. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't relying on anyone else for her survival. In the beginning, she struggled with feelings of inadequacy. She doubted herself, unsure whether she was truly capable of standing on her own. But slowly, the more she worked, the more she grew in confidence. She began to realize that she had a strength that had always been inside her, a strength that the abuse had tried to break but could never fully destroy. She started setting goals for herself, things that were once unimaginable, like renting her own apartment and eventually going back to school. For the first time, she felt a sense of control over her own future. The stability of her job provided her with a foundation to make other positive changes. Emily found herself making new friends, people who didn't know her as the victim of abuse, but as the strong, capable woman she was becoming. She even began attending support groups for survivors of domestic violence, where she met others who shared similar stories. These groups gave her the opportunity to process her feelings and gain insight into the trauma that she had endured. Through these conversations, Emily realized that her past didn't define her future. She could build a new identity, one free from the pain of her earlier life. Emily also began to reconnect with the world around her in ways she hadn't before. She started exploring new hobbies like painting and hiking, and she found herself beginning to enjoy life again. The new sense of freedom she had was exhilarating. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt hope for her future. She understood now that the strength to overcome her past was within her, and she would continue to move forward, no matter the obstacles. Facing the past, despite her newfound independence and the joy she was finding in her new life, Emily knew that one of the most challenging steps in her journey would be facing the people from her past, especially her mother, Lucy, and her abusive stepfather, Charles. Emily had worked so hard to create a new life for herself, and she had come so far in her healing process, but there was still a lingering uncertainty about how to handle the people who had caused her so much pain. The first time Emily saw her mother again, it was like stepping back into a world she had fought so hard to leave behind. Lucy was still with Charles, and despite everything, there was a deep part of Emily that longed for the mother. She had once known the mother who had been strong and protective before the abuse had worn her down. When they met at a local cafe, the conversation was awkward at first. Lucy, her eyes filled with regret, apologized profusely for everything that had happened, but Emily couldn't help feeling the sting of betrayal. Emily had worked so hard to forgive her mother, but seeing her still stuck in the same toxic relationship made it difficult to keep those feelings of resentment at bay. For a long time, Emily had wished that her mother would leave Charles, that she would fight for them, for herself, but Lucy had stayed, paralyzed by her own fears and emotional scars. Emily couldn't understand it, but she had learned not to judge. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't about understanding everything or fixing the past. It was about releasing herself from the anger that had held her captive for so long. While Lucy apologized for not being the protector Emily needed, Emily had to come to terms with the fact that no one could change the past. What mattered now was what came next. Emily realized that she couldn't change Lucy's decisions, but she could choose to let go of the past and forge her own path. She didn't need her mother's approval or validation anymore. Emily had learned to trust herself and her own instincts, and she realized that she had become the person she always needed her mother to be, a protector of her own well-being. As for Charles, Emily had no intention of letting him back into her life. She had long ago made the decision that she would never allow anyone to abuse her again, not even for the sake of family. Charles was a reminder of everything she had fought to escape, and Emily had learned to let go of the anger she once felt toward him. He was no longer the person who controlled her. He was nothing more than a shadow in her past. But it wasn't easy. There were moments when Emily felt the weight of her past bear down on her, when memories of the abuse and the helplessness she had felt would creep into her thoughts. But with each passing day, Emily grew stronger. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was no longer a passive bystander in her own life. She had taken control, and the more she embraced her own power, the less hold her past had over her. Facing her mother and Charles was a painful experience, but it was also a cathartic one. Emily realized that by confronting her past, she was able to truly let go of it. She didn't need their approval or acceptance. She had proven to herself that she could survive, thrive, and build a life she could be proud of. And as she looked forward to her future, Emily knew that nothing could ever take away the strength she had gained. She was no longer defined by the people who had hurt her. She was defined by the woman she had become, embracing the new Emily. Now, with a new sense of freedom and strength, Emily faced the future with open arms. She wasn't afraid anymore. She knew that life would still have challenges, but she was ready to meet them head-on. Her journey was far from over, but she had proven to herself that she could overcome anything. The new Emily was someone who loved herself, someone who stood up for her rights, and someone who would never again let anyone take away her peace or her power. As she walked through her new life, Emily embraced every moment of it, knowing that the strength she had fought so hard to find was the very thing that would carry her through the rest of her journey. She had found a new beginning, and with it, a renewed sense of hope for what the future could hold. Freedom and happiness. A life of freedom. Emily's life had finally shifted in the direction she longed for, away from the darkness of her past and into the freedom she had always dreamed of. No longer was she trapped in a cycle of fear and isolation. Every day, she woke up in a home that was her own, with no one to tell her what to do or how to feel. For the first time in years, Emily didn't have to worry about the harsh sounds of violence, the insults from her stepfather, or the tension that clung to the air in her old home. This newfound freedom was not just about escaping from her abuser, but also about embracing her independence. Emily reveled in the simple joys of everyday life that once seemed impossible. She enjoyed the mornings where she could sip her coffee without being rushed, where the sun gently streamed through her window, and the only sound she heard were birds chirping and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. These were small moments, but for Emily, they were monumental. They signified peace, something she had never fully experienced in her childhood. Emily also learned to appreciate the power of choice. She could choose how to spend her days, what she wanted to wear, what music to play, and even what food to cook for dinner. In the past, these choices had been stripped from her, controlled by a violent and manipulative figure. But now, she was the one making decisions that directly impacted her happiness. This control over her own life became the foundation for Emily's healing process. As she navigated her new life, Emily discovered the beauty of doing things for herself, not for anyone's approval or to escape punishment, but simply because it made her happy. She began to explore hobbies she had long neglected, like painting and journaling. These activities, simple as they were, brought her a sense of fulfillment and joy. They allowed her to express herself, to process her emotions, and to reclaim a sense of identity that had been lost under the weight of years of abuse. Living freely also meant that Emily could surround herself with people who genuinely cared for her, people who didn't judge her for her past or see her as a victim. She had built a new circle of friends, some of whom had experienced their own hardships. These friendships gave Emily a sense of belonging, something she had never felt growing up. She realized that true friendship wasn't about perfect people. It was about people who accepted each other with all their flaws, who supported one another through thick and thin. Emily began to feel like she was part of something bigger than herself, a community of people who understood and supported her. Happiness is not perfection. In her journey toward healing, Emily came to a profound realization. Happiness was not about reaching some unattainable state of perfection. She had spent much of her life believing that happiness meant everything in her life falling into place, with no struggles, no conflicts, and no pain. But as she navigated her new life, she began to understand that happiness was not about achieving perfection, it was about embracing the journey, the ups and downs, and finding meaning in the process. Emily had once believed that happiness was a final destination, a place where everything would be flawless and where the scars of her past would no longer matter. But as she moved forward, she saw that the idea of perfection was a mirage. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and times when life didn't go according to plan. Yet, despite these obstacles, Emily realized that happiness could still be found in those moments, not because they were perfect, but because she had the strength to move through them. For instance, she had moments of deep loneliness, especially when the world outside seemed to be bustling with families and couples. On certain nights, Emily would sit in her apartment, the silence around her almost overwhelming. She missed the warmth of a family, the laughter that filled the air, and the sense of being loved unconditionally. But she also realized that the absence of these things didn't mean she couldn't be happy. Emily found solace in the quiet, using the time to reconnect with herself, to appreciate the progress she had made, and to be thankful for the strength she had found within. Moreover, Emily started to redefine what it meant to be whole. She no longer thought of herself as a broken person who needed to be fixed. Instead, she embraced the concept that we are all constantly evolving, learning, and growing. Perfection was never the goal, growth was. And with every challenge she faced, Emily became more resilient, more self-aware, and more at peace with who she was. Happiness also came from Emily's ability to let go of the need for approval from others. She had spent so much of her life seeking validation from the wrong sources: her mother, her stepfather, and others who didn't have her best interests at heart. But now, Emily was learning to validate herself. She didn't need anyone else to tell her she was worthy or capable. She had proven to herself that she was strong and capable, And that realization was the greatest source of happiness she had ever known. In her work, in her friendships, and in her quiet moments alone, Emily discovered that happiness wasn't a final destination, but a collection of small, meaningful moments. It was in the laughter of a friend, the satisfaction of accomplishing a task on her own, the peace of a quiet evening with a good book, and the joy of personal growth. These were the things that brought her happiness, not perfection, and she learned to appreciate them fully. A future filled with hope. As Emily continued her journey, she knew that life would never be without its challenges. But she also knew that she was no longer the person she once was. The girl who had been broken by abuse, by the absence of love, and by fear was no more. In her place stood a woman who had reclaimed her sense of self-worth, who had learned to love herself, and who knew that happiness wasn't something to be waited for, it was something to be cultivated in every moment. For the first time in her life, Emily was truly free. Free from the chains of her past, free from the fear of what might come next, and free to live her life on her terms. She had everything she needed to move forward, the strength to face whatever came her way, the wisdom to know that happiness was not a destination, and the courage to embrace every imperfect moment that life had to offer. As she looked toward the future, Emily didn't know exactly what it would bring. But for the first time, she was excited about what was to come. She was no longer defined by her past or by the people who had hurt her. She was defined by the woman. She had become someone capable of love, of growth, and of finding happiness in the everyday moments of life. Thank you for watching Emily's incredible journey of transformation. It's not easy to leave behind years of abuse, but her story proves that it's possible to start fresh and rebuild your life. We hope her journey inspires you to believe in your own strength and potential. If you found this video inspiring, please like and subscribe to Stories TH for more powerful stories. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.